So this presentation is on the ethics of abortion, and I'm going to spend a lot of time, the bulk of the time, talking about this extremely famous essay by Judith Jarvis Thompson from the early 70s that kind of set the stage for the philosophical treatment of this issue overall. And so she kind of started the conversation in the philosophical literature in this really deep way, and pretty much everybody else, one way or another, has really kind of been responding to her arguments or just building on them one way or another. Okay, just a teensy bit of stage setting here first. So an abortion, of course, is the termination of a pregnancy, right? And so it's the destruction of that potential offspring anyway, anywhere between the fertilized egg stage and birth, as opposed to stopping the formation of the zygote to begin with, which is sometimes confusingly called birth control, but more appropriately perhaps called contraception. And so this is on the ethics of abortion primarily, and the authors that we're looking at, whether they are anti-abortion or they think that abortion should be morally permissible, they will all agree that contraception is morally permissible. Okay, another concept that's going to be central to a lot of this is the concept of a person, at least in ethics, what it is to be a person. And there's lots of different ways of describing sort of what qualities it takes to be a person and sort of what beings qualify as persons and which don't. But one way or another, being a person gives someone a extra moral consideration, right? So we might say certain rights, moral rights, maybe legal rights as well, but moral rights at least kick in when a being is a person. And typically in ethics, we think of a person as someone who has certain mental characteristics, sort of a certain level of self-awareness, maybe so strong as to say free will, whatever that is, and then also perhaps a sense of morality in general, sort of a basic understanding of what it is to be right and wrong. And that sort of brings us to kind of the other part of being a person, is that typically in ethics, we think that a person bears extra moral responsibility. We can hold them morally accountable for their actions. Okay, so just the kind of the stereotypical superficial approach here to start things off. The typical pro-life position says that the embryo perhaps is a person, right? And so has a right to life. And that right to life outweighs the right of the mother to determine how her body would be used. Whereas the pro-choice position would typically say that abortion does not count as murder, of course. And typically they would say that because the embryo, fetus, would not be a person. So it seems like the question would come down to whether the embryo is a person or not. And this is, in some ways, relatively straightforward. As I said, to qualify as a person, you need to have certain mental characteristics, a certain self-awareness, a certain sort of just consciousness level, as opposed to, say, for example, a human that had been a person, but is now brain dead, right? So that they're going to the other end of the life spectrum here. So somebody through injury or just old age, one way or another, their brain has deteriorated to the point that they are not a conscious being anymore, and there's just no hope of them recovering that consciousness. So that they really are brain dead. Well, their moral status changes at that point. Certainly we don't hold them morally accountable for what they do because they can't really do anything. And also sort of their rights to medical care, for example, and life support and those sorts of things would go away because they just don't have those mental characteristics anymore to qualify as a person, so their moral status changes. So is the embryo a person? Well, if what I've been saying about what qualifies as a person is the right approach here, then clearly the embryo and the fetus even does not qualify as a person. It does not have those mental characteristics, especially the earlier we go in the pregnancy, right? So the zygote stage through the embryo stage, there's really not even an identifiable brain that could support, as far as we know, that could support any kind of consciousness at all, let alone the kind of consciousness that would be required to qualify as a person. So the fetus does not currently have those features, so it's not a person currently. It's not actually a person. But nevertheless, the pro-life side might say that the embryo certainly has the potential to develop the features required for becoming a person, and even the the pro-choice side would still have to acknowledge that. I mean, that's the whole point, is to have something that could develop into a person. So we might say having this very strong potential to become a person might actually be enough to qualify you for having a right to life. So that brings us to this kind of distinction that's been around in philosophy for at least as long as Aristotle, that there's this important distinction between actuality and potentiality. And I brought in this quotation from Judith Jarvis Thompson's essay that has become fairly well known, that calling a fetus a person is like calling an acorn an oak tree, because Aristotle talked about acorn has the potential to become an oak tree, but the acorn itself is not currently an oak tree. You have just an acorn sitting on the table here, doesn't have any leaves or roots or xylem or phloem or any of the things that we would associate with a tree. So calling an acorn a tree is just, as we might call it, a category mistake, right? You're just miscategorizing this thing. Although, obviously, if it's planted and it's under the right conditions for long enough, it could grow into an oak tree, so it certainly has that potential. Okay, so let's just say then that take kind of the relatively strong pro-choice side for a moment here and think of the embryo and fetus is not currently a person, and so it does not have the right to life. And so this brings us to a relatively straightforward pro-choice argument, right? So arguing in favor of the ethical, moral permissibility of abortion. And that actually, we can look at Michael Tooley's famous essay on this from also the early 1970s. So the embryo doesn't have the characteristics required to be a person. Only persons have a right to life. So therefore the embryo does not have a right to life, and we could maybe conclude from that that abortion is permissible. Certainly is not saying that abortion is like somehow always the right choice or somehow that's just like completely unproblematic, but nevertheless, it doesn't count as murder, right? And so the interests of the mother and the way that her body is used would override the interests, so to speak, of the embryo or the fetus, though it doesn't have any mentality yet, it doesn't have any consciousness, so it doesn't have interests in that sense. It's just sort of like bare bones biological interests, I suppose. So abortion would be permissible under these circumstances. But notice the title of Michael Tooley's essay here. Abortion, okay, we just talked about that, but then infanticide. So maybe you can anticipate where his argument goes from here, because he's now been challenging. He's sort of, he thinks that this is sort of a plausible approach here, but then he presents us with this very difficult challenge, because we have to acknowledge then that certainly late-term fetuses and in as far as we can tell, newborn babies also do not have the characteristics required to be a person. They might have some kind of consciousness. It's kind of hard to tell exactly what's going on inside anybody's mind, but it's really hard to tell what's going on inside of a newborn baby's mind, an infant's mind, because of course it can't communicate with us in that way to be able to give us a sense. But does it have sort of this robust self-awareness, a kind of free will beyond just its instinctual reactions and wants and needs sort of right there in the moment? Does it have any sense of right and wrong? Does it have any concepts of morality or anything of that sort that we would consider to be required to qualify as a moral person, right? As qualify for personhood in the strong moral sense? Well, it seems like maybe not. So newborn infants don't have the characteristics required to be a person. There's the same argument that we just saw applied to fetuses. Only persons have a right to life, therefore newborns don't have a right to life. So then it seems like we might be pushed into a similar conclusion that we drew regarding embryos and fetuses, that in killing it is permissible. If the interest of the caregiver is to have this thing gone, then maybe it's not an act of murder. that killing it, although sort of intuitively we would say this is one of the very worst things that somebody could do, killing a baby. It's like, that's sort of monstrous. Nevertheless, Tully is challenging us here, right? He's not really thinking that it's okay to kill babies. Instead, he's really presenting us with this difficulty of like, how do we justify kind of the standard pro-choice argument that fetuses aren't persons and that's why abortion is permissible? Then why can't we make the move to saying that infanticide is also permissible? And there might be some ways around that, of course. You know, there's adoption as an option. You know, there's other people that could care for this infant, even if the parents don't want this infant anymore. And so, you know, there's a lot more to say there. But the whole point is that perhaps the initial argument, merely in terms of the lack of personhood on the part of the embryo, isn't the best argument that pro-choice people would want to go for, because that makes it difficult for them to show why infanticide is actually really bad, which I think most, even pro-choice people would say that killing a newborn baby is actually really bad and probably a case of murder. But if it's murder to kill a newborn, then it seems like it might be murder to kill an embryo as well, maybe a fetus, because both of them have a strong potential to become persons, but are not currently persons. Okay, so onto the kind of standard pro-life viewpoints. There are at least two sort of general approaches here, right? That the strongest one is that the abortion is always a case of murder, and it's never justified, even when the mother's life is in danger. You know, it does not matter the circumstances. This is a relatively rare viewpoint. Even most pro-life people, you know, anti-abortion folks, would acknowledge that abortion could be permissible if the mother's life is threatened, or even if her health is very seriously threatened, or her quality of life is very seriously threatened, because then it starts to seem a little bit more like self-defense laws, right? And so B here, right? The second viewpoint is much more common. Okay, so that said, now we can finally get into Thompson's actual arguments here. So her pro-life opponents, by the way, Thompson is arguing, I mean, the title of her essay is A Defense of Abortion. So clearly she's going to be arguing in favor of some kind of pro-choice position here, right? That abortion can be morally permissible. So how does she get there? Well, first she has to deal with this question of, you know, does the embryo have a right to life or not? She thinks it doesn't, because it's not a person, but her opponents might say that it does because it has the potential to be a person. So is the potential to be a person enough to give you the right to life? Well, that's an incredibly difficult question. It's not clear how we resolve that. The arguments from either side does not move anybody on the other side at all. So she takes this interesting strategy. She just says, okay, let's just avoid that whole thorny mess about the potential to become a person being enough to give you the right to life or not. And just say, like, all right, let's just say that the embryo is a person. Let's just start there. And so she grants that premise to her opponents. Nevertheless, she's going to end up arguing that abortion, nevertheless, is morally permissible in a wide variety of cases. So that's her strategy. Okay, and the way that she does this turns out to be kind of a very common, nowadays, very common argument strategy. It's called argument by analogy. And so argument by analogy is frequently used in cases like this, where we're dealing with a question, some morally fraught issue that many people already have very strong and firm positions about, right? They're not very willing to change their beliefs in the face of somebody's direct argument against their beliefs. And people have also perhaps very strong emotional reactions to this. So instead of directly arguing her point on abortion itself, she comes up with this hypothetical scenario. And this scenario that she comes up with has the same relevant moral features as the scenario we're actually interested in, which is, of course, abortion. But with this hypothetical scenario that's analogous to abortion, we work through some moral reasoning there and come to what she believes to be the correct conclusion on this hypothetical scenario. Then once we've done that, then we kind of export that reasoning over to the situation that we're actually interested in, the ethics of abortion, and see how it plays out there. And so it gives us this one step of remove from this very difficult and very fraught question of the morality of abortion, and helps us to think through it in a slightly more dispassionate way. At least that's her intent. And so she was one of the people that really established this technique in the philosophical literature, and many people have done that since she published this essay. So her scenario that she comes up with is, not surprisingly, one of the most famous hypothetical scenarios that philosophers have ever thought of. And it's called the violinist scenario. So imagine there's a famous violinist who has some kind of rare organ failure, let's say. The specific medical condition is kind of irrelevant for our considerations here, but just to kind of fill it in, maybe it's something like kidney failure. And really the only way to save this violinist is to find somebody who's willing to sort of perform this organ function for the violinist. So they need to have their bloodstreams connected in this special way so that the person who's helping will be able to kind of perform the life functions for the violinist. So it turns out then that the Society for Music Lovers discovers that you are a compatible person for the violinist here. So while you're sleeping, right, they knock you out somehow, they kidnap you, and then you wake up and you are connected through your bloodstream to this violinist who's maybe unconscious because of his organ failure. And so now you're providing organ function for the violinist. And coincidentally, it could maybe take about 9 months for the violinist to recover, at which time you can disconnect. If you disconnect early, however, the violinist will die. So the question is, are you permitted to disconnect, or are you required to stay connected? Once you wake up in the hospital or whatever, and you realize that you're connected to this violinist, are you morally required to stay connected to keep him alive, or are you permitted to disconnect? Well, Thompson, of course, argues that you are permitted to disconnect from the violinist, knowing full well that the violinist will die as a result. So you can foresee that the violinist will die. Now, some might say, like, well, hold on, this seems like you're killing the violinist somehow, like you're responsible for keeping the violinist alive, and you've decided to just like say no, and now maybe you're responsible for killing the violinist. Well, Thompson argues in this special way. I'm going to kind of go back to a previous slide that I skipped, but it's now become relevant, so I need to go back to it here. And it's this one. It has to do with rights, and in this case, of course, the right to life. There's a distinction in the literature between positive rights and negative rights. And positive and negative is not used here in sort of the good versus bad sense. It's in terms of like what the right entails, what the right requires of other people. A positive right has to do with something that you're required to be given. So for example, the right to a trial, a criminal trial if you're accused of a crime, that's something you have a right to be given, or legal representation during that trial. You have a right, a constitutional right, to be given a lawyer to help you out during legal proceedings if you're accused of a crime. So that would be a positive right, things that you're required to be given by other people. A negative right has to do with things that other people are not allowed to do to you, or not allowed to take from you, or not allowed to prevent you from accessing. Notice in each case I said other people are not allowed to do something. That whole not allowed to phrasing applied to these other people. That's why this is called a negative right, because it's a restriction on what other people are allowed to do to you, or take from you, or prevent you from doing. So that then plays big in Thompson's argument, because have you violated the violinist's right to life when you disconnect? Well, the right to life, it turns out, is a negative right. If you have a right to life, then that means that other people are not allowed to kill you. And so have you violated the violinist's right to life here? And Thompson says no. That in fact, the right to life is a negative right, not a positive right. If it was if it was a positive right, then that would mean the violinist has a right to be given life, or in this case, be given life support by somebody, whoever is capable. And so that's not the way the right to life works. The right to life is actually a negative right, not a positive right. So when you disconnect, you are not, Thompson says, you are not violating the violinist's right to life, because the violinist does not have a right to be given life support by you. You have a right to decide who gets life support that's provided by you. Nobody has a right to demand it of you. So disconnecting in this case is permissible, even though you can foresee that the violinist will die as a result. Nevertheless, she argues, this is not a violation of his right to life, so it's not murder. Okay, so presuming folks are on board with that decision or that conclusion of Thompson's argument, maybe you can guess sort of how this applies to the abortion case. It's pretty closely analogous to abortion, but a particular circumstance of abortion. And of course, it's abortion when the pregnancy is non-consensual, right? It's an unwanted pregnancy for these special reasons, in these special cases, right? So it's non-consensual use of somebody's body as life support for somebody else. And that's what's happening in the violinist case, right? You've been kidnapped, it's against your will. You've been forced to provide life support for this violinist. And you never even really had a chance to say yes or no. And so in this case, it would be non-voluntary, right? Non-voluntary is when you can't say, you don't ever get a chance to say yes or no. But it could also be an involuntary, right? Like the Society for Music Lovers comes and tries to connect you up, and you're like fighting them, and you say, no, 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 don't do this to me. But then they knock you out and do it anyway. So this clearly is non-consensual use of your body to provide life support for somebody else. And interestingly, in this case, the somebody else is not the Society of Music Lovers. Clearly they've done something bad, right? They've kidnapped you and done these things against your will. But the violinist is innocent. He's a person, he has a right to life, he's innocent. Nevertheless, Thompson is arguing it's permissible for you to disconnect. So same thing then in the actual pregnancy case. So the fetus is innocent, right? Hasn't had a chance to do anything wrong. In this case, she granted the premise, remember, that the embryo or fetus or whatnot is a person with a right to life. But nevertheless, disconnecting, right? Getting rid of that embryo, stopping the providing of life support for this being is nevertheless morally permissible because you did not agree to it. So, one of the most horrible examples of this kind of a scenario is when a woman is raped, right? When the pregnancy is a result of rape, very clearly that is a non-consensual situation. And again, though, even though the embryo or the fetus is sort of innocent in this situation, the mother then has a right to end the pregnancy because it was non-consensual, according to Thompson's argument here. So, part of the upshot here, just to kind of summarize things so far, abortion is morally permissible in cases of non-consensual pregnancy. That is, if consent is refused. And we'll get into this next, coming up here in just a moment. If consent is refused explicitly or implicitly. So what exactly does she mean by that? So we'll see what she means in a moment. But then on the other hand, if consent is given, then it seems like you are committed to providing life support. You have agreed. So for example, in the violinist case, if instead of kidnapping you, they just asked you and said, would you be willing to do this? And you said, yes, I am on board. This is something I want to be able to do. This is my favorite violinist, perhaps. And so I want to help keep this person alive for as long as necessary, the 9 months until finally I can disconnect and we can go our separate ways. But then after a while, you decide, no, I don't really want to do this anymore. So are you still permitted to disconnect? Well, technically, it's still not a violation of the violinist's right to life, but nevertheless, perhaps this other moral consideration is kicked in that you promised, right? You gave your word that you would do this. You agreed to it. You did give consent. And so then you are sort of morally on the hook for that, right? Maybe it doesn't quite qualify as murder, but nevertheless, you bear moral responsibility as opposed to in the non-consensual situation where you don't bear moral responsibility. And keep in mind, again, just as a reminder, this is all under the assumption that the zygote, embryo, fetus, and so on is a person with a right to life. If that assumption is removed, then the moral considerations become even more lax. But anyway, on to this question of explicit or implicit consent. So, consent is given, of course, if people have sex, a couple has sex with the intent to conceive. If you're trying to have a baby, well, then that's clearly consent, right? That's very obvious and straightforward. But then she continues on and says, well, this is also true if people are having sex without any kind of contraception at all. Presumably we know where babies come from, and so as long as the people can't plead ignorance somehow here, then it's not good enough to say, no, we don't want to have a baby, we don't want to get pregnant, but nevertheless, we're going to do the exact thing that leads to pregnancy, knowing full well where it's going to lead. So have you really said no to pregnancy here? She says, seems like maybe you've given a kind of implicit consent. Even if you've said, no, we don't want to get pregnant, your actions say otherwise. And in this case, it's the actions that matter, because that's what's going to lead to the creation of this being. Same thing with sex with inadequate contraception, right? So using some technique that we know, that reasonable people should know, that does not work. So again, even if you explicitly say that you don't want to get pregnant, but then you do the exact thing that's going to lead to pregnancy without any kind of really reasonable efforts to prevent that from happening, then you're kind of morally on the hook here. Okay, but what about the non-consensual case? Well, I said the particularly horrible one when it's pregnancy as a result of rape. But it could also be, and this is perhaps the more interesting one, that kind of expands it out further than many people that would be leaning towards pro-life, anti-abortion side. This sort of expands on beyond what they may be willing to allow, which is consensual sex with reasonable contraception that failed, right? And so people are engaging in sexual activity, right? They're having sex, but they are using what is considered to be reasonable contraception techniques. But if the reasonable contraception technique fails and then pregnancy happens, then Thompson says this is a case of non-consensual pregnancy. And then if that's the case, then abortion would be permissible, morally permissible under those circumstances. Now we might say, well, really the only guaranteed technique of avoiding pregnancy is abstinence, but she argues that that's sort of unreasonable especially for committed couples, and think of a married couple, and so we wouldn't want to say, or at least Thompson wouldn't want to say, that that couple is not allowed to have sex at all unless they are fully committed to producing an offspring. She says, no, that's unreasonable. Sex is a part of a healthy romantic relationship, so the couple should be allowed to do that without committing themselves to getting pregnant and having a child. So they should be allowed to have sex with adequate contraception, but if that contraception fails and they get pregnant anyway, then abortion could be permissible. Okay. So that's a very brief overview of a very sort of rich and very interesting and influential essay by Judith Jarvis Thompson. So I encourage you to check out her essay to find sort of a variety of other thought experiments and arguments by analogy that she includes in there that are really useful. So, but I'll look at a sort of a pro-life or an argument against the ethical permissibility of abortion as well. And this one comes from Don Marquis. Yeah, I know his last name here is spelled like the word marquee, but I've always heard it pronounced Marquis, so that's what I'm sticking with. He is going to argue that abortion, even from the zygote stage onward, is before birth, of course, that those are going to count as murder. And the way that he does that is first by thinking about, why do we consider murder of sort of regular, persons, right, adults like us? Why do we consider that to be so bad? Why is it considered to be perhaps the worst kind of crime, or at least among the worst crimes that somebody could commit is murder? Well, he first starts by looking at lesser crimes like theft and assault, kidnapping, those sorts of things. So why are those bad? Well, they're bad because something's being taken from the victim. In the case of theft, obviously it's property or money or something that's being taken. In assault, it's your well-being, your health, your sort of own bodily integrity is being taken. Or kidnapping, it's your freedom is being taken. And so that's why those crimes are bad, right? That's why they're morally bad. So in murder, everything is being taken from the victim. Obviously their life, but any plans or interests or things that they had in front of them, their whole future, their entire future is being taken from them. They had this future in front of them, Marquis thinks, and so when you take that, you are taking everything. So while those other crimes, those lesser crimes are bad because they're taking something, murder becomes the worst because it's taking everything. So this is kind of his starting point for thinking about why murder is bad. And this leads into his strategy for avoiding the whole potential problem. Remember the problem of the embryo, fetus, whatnot, having the potential to become a person. Having the potential to become a person, is that enough for you to have a right to life? Well, that potentiality question is so difficult that, like Thompson, Marquis here is going to try to just dodge it. And this is the way that he does it, that it's all about the future that's there waiting for you. It's wrong to kill me because you're depriving me of that future that's sitting there in front of me. It's not a potential future. It is an actual future that's in front of me that you are taking from me if you were to kill me. That's why murder is wrong, why murdering me is wrong. And anything that has a future that's similar to one of our futures, right? I mean, we'll have ups and downs, you know, good times and bad times and so on, but I have a right to that future. That's my future. You can't take it away from me because that's a violation of my right to that life, that future life that I'm going to be sort of living into, so to speak. It's like they're waiting for me. This is kind of the view of the future that Marquis is providing for us here. And so anybody that has a future that's even roughly like that at all, it seems like the kind of future that would be worth living, that's a future like ours. So that's distinguished from, say, somebody who's got a very serious illness or injury somehow, so there's not really much of a chance of any kind of fulfilling life. You know, their brain injured in a very severe way, so they're very seriously handicapped somehow, or they maybe even are brain dead. Then somebody who's brain dead might still have a future there, right? But it's not a future like ours. It's just a future where they're just sort of sitting there and they're not doing anything. They have no plans or hopes or desires or anything in front of them. So anything that has a future like ours then has a right to that future, and then since that's a future life, they have a right to that life. So anything with a future like ours, an FLO or even just a flow, is something that has a right to life. So that brings us then to this argument by Marquis. A zygote, he says, is an identifiably distinct individual with a future like ours. Identifiably distinct here, so this is different than, say, just an egg, right, the ovum by itself before it's fertilized. This has the, although it's only half the chromosomes of the mother, nevertheless, it's all the mother's chromosomes. So it's not distinct in the same way that the zygote is distinct, because the zygote is a unique combination of both the mother's and the father's chromosomes. And so it is at least genetically distinct individual. And then once we've got that, Marquis is arguing, then we've got something that's got an actual future in front of it, a distinct individual with a future. So it's not a potential future. The zygote's potential is, or the zygote's future is not any more of a potential future than my future is. If my future is an actual future in front of me, then so is the zygote's, Marquis says here. So just kind of filling in the details, right? Anything with a future like ours has a right to life. So destroying a being with a right to life is murder, and so therefore is not permissible. So therefore abortion is murder and is not permissible. So this sort of rules out sort of anything having to do with birth control or contraception. Contraception is still permissible according to this argument because that's preventing the formation of the zygote. And Marquis's argument here really only kicks in once the zygote has actually been formed. So this is one of the more interesting arguments against the permissibility of abortion. You might have noticed on that previous slide that Marquis published his paper in 1987. So that was over a decade after Thompson published her essay. And it's interesting that Marquis does not consider Thompson's argument here at all. So it's left sort of up to us to think about sort of the interaction between Marquis's argument and Thompson's argument. So even if we sort of accept Marquis's argument, does that mean that Thompson was wrong? Or does Thompson's argument still apply? Because remember, Thompson granted that the embryo, that the zygote basically, is a person with a right to life, but then went on to argue that abortion is permissible anyway in a wide variety of cases, the non-consensual pregnancy cases. Marquis doesn't really address that in his essay, so we can think about, if they got into a debate here, whose argument would end up being stronger. Okay, so I think I will go ahead and stop there, and thanks.